The king sat upon his throne, his eyes sharp with suspicion and his voice cold with authority as he pronounced her fate. The girl, trembling before him, could hardly believe that her pleas for truth had fallen on deaf ears. She was no rebel, no challenger to the crown, only a girl who had lived quietly among the huts of her village, fetching water from the stream, gathering firewood and tending to her small garden. But the king had been told otherwise. Envious tongues whispered lies, claiming she had spoken against him, that she questioned his rule and encouraged others to do the same. His pride would not allow him to appear weak, not even for a moment. And so, without investigation, without mercy, he gave his judgment before all. Her hands would be chained. The guards stepped forward, tall and merciless, their polished armor reflecting the flames of the great torches that lined the hall. They dragged her across the stone floor as the crowd watched in uneasy silence. No one dared intervene. Some turned their eyes away, unwilling to witness her humiliation. Others stared intently as if to convince themselves that her suffering was necessary to preserve order. But there were those, hidden in the shadows of the hall, whose hearts stirred uneasily, for they knew the girl was innocent. Still, fear sealed their lips. The chains were brought forward, thick and heavy, made of iron forged in the king's own foundries. Their very presence was meant to inspire dread, for they had bound many before her, thieves, traitors and warriors who had fallen in disgrace. Now, for the first time, they would close around the wrists of a young girl whose only crime was being the target of jealousy. The king's guard, with a cruel sense of duty, forced her arms forward and wound the cold metal around them. With each turn, the iron clamped tighter, until her skin pressed against it and her fingers twitched from the pressure. The hall was silent, save for the clinking of metal. The weight of the punishment was not only physical but symbolic. The king had intended it to be a warning, a message to every villager and subject that defiance, whether true or false, would be crushed swiftly. Her pain was to be a spectacle, a reminder that even the lowliest among them could not escape his wrath. And so the guards pulled the chains taut, binding her hands before her as if she were some dangerous criminal who threatened the peace of the realm. Her mother, who had followed her into the hall, cried out, her voice breaking against the cold stone walls. She begged for mercy, insisting that her daughter had done no wrong, but her words were drowned in the murmurs of the gathered crowd and the stern command of silence from the soldiers. The girl lifted her head to look at her mother, her tear-streaked face filled not with fear but with a deep sorrow that she could not comfort the one who had raised her. In that moment, she understood that the punishment was not only her burden to bear but her mother's as well. The iron cut deeper as the guards secured it, leaving faint red marks along her wrists. She winced but did not scream. Her silence struck those watching more than any cry of pain would have. It was the silence of dignity, of quiet strength against injustice. Some in the hall shifted uneasily, questioning the king's decision in their hearts, though none dared to voice it aloud. The girl's resolve, though her body trembled, seemed to resist the very purpose of the punishment. The king's face remained stern, though behind his eyes flickered something, perhaps doubt, perhaps irritation that she had not broken in spirit as easily as he expected. He raised his hand and declared that her chains would remain until the village understood the cost of rebellion, real or imagined. She was to be paraded through the marketplace so that her suffering might be witnessed by all. The guards pulled her to her feet, the chains rattling like the voice of fate itself. As she was dragged out of the hall, the villagers whispered among themselves. Some pitied her, some feared that to show sympathy would invite the king's anger upon themselves, and others simply followed the spectacle with curiosity. But no one could deny that the punishment was harsh, harsher than the supposed crime demanded. A seed of unease was planted in their hearts that day, a quiet recognition that envy and cruelty had led to an innocent girl's suffering. The iron bit into her hands with every step, each movement carving the weight of injustice deeper into her flesh. Yet though her body ached and her wrists burned, her eyes remained steady. Somewhere within her, a fire had begun to kindle, faint but unyielding, born of pain but shaped by a truth greater than the king's decree. The punishment had been meant to silence her, to crush her spirit. But instead, it was forging something unseen, something stronger than even the chains of iron could restrain. The chains were not placed gently, they were forced upon her wrists with a cruelty meant to humiliate and break her spirit. The guards, hardened by years of carrying out the king's merciless orders, yanked her arms forward and clasped the heavy iron around them until the cold bite of metal closed like a serpent's jaws. At first, she tried to hold back her cries, unwilling to show weakness before those who had condemned her without listening to her pleas. But as the guards tightened the shackles, the jagged edges carved into her flesh, and a sharp, burning sting shot through her veins. The pain was so sudden and severe that her knees buckled, but they held her up, forcing her to remain on display before the crowd. Blood began to bead around the cuffs, darkening the rusted iron with fresh red stains, and the sound of metal grinding against bone sent shivers down the spines of those who dared to look too closely. The villagers stood gathered in the square, their faces shadows of guilt and fear. Some looked away, unable to watch the suffering of a girl who had once walked among them as a friend, a sister, or a neighbor. Others stared, their eyes wide with silent dread, too terrified of the king's wrath to move or protest. Mothers held their children closer, shielding them from the sight, while elders muttered prayers under their breath, though no one dared to speak them aloud. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the clanking of the chains and the hiss of her labored breathing as she struggled against the pain. She searched the crowd for one sympathetic face, someone who might step forward to defend her, but every gaze that met hers quickly fell away. Loneliness pressed down on her chest even more than the iron, and she felt abandoned by the very people she had once trusted. Each tug of the chains was a reminder of the injustice that had led her here. She remembered the accusation, the hurried judgment, the way her words had been dismissed as though her voice carried no weight. And now these chains spoke for the king, symbols of his authority and cruelty, meant to teach the village obedience through her suffering. Every movement of her bound hands sent fire racing through her nerves, and soon her palms grew slick with sweat and blood. The cuffs ground deeper, cutting past skin into raw, trembling muscle. The sight was unbearable, and yet the guards did not relent. Instead they sneered, enjoying the spectacle of her torment. To them, she was no longer a girl with a name and a life but a vessel for the king's warning. But though her body shook from the agony, her spirit refused to bow. Her breaths came ragged, her vision blurred with tears, but inside her chest a stubborn flame refused to be extinguished. She clenched her jaw, determined not to cry out for mercy that would never come. The villagers saw it too, the quiet strength in her eyes even as blood dripped to the earth below. Whispers passed through the crowd, hushed and trembling as some began to feel shame. They had allowed fear to bind their tongues, just as iron bound her hands. And as her blood seeped into the dust at her feet, it carried with it a silent accusation, not against the king alone, but against every villager who chose silence over truth. The chains had been meant to weaken her, to crush her will, but instead, they revealed the cruelty of those in power and the cowardice of those who obeyed without question. With each throb of pain, her spirit grew stronger, though her body faltered. She felt herself swaying, the world tilting as darkness threatened to pull her under. Yet even in that haze, she knew that something deep and unseen stirred in the air around her. Her suffering had not gone unnoticed by forces greater than kings or guards. The silence of the village might have betrayed her, but the earth itself seemed to listen, and the wind carried the faintest echo of a promise yet to come. Her lips remained pressed together, trembling under the weight of fear and pain, but not a single sound escaped them. Around her, the courtyard was filled with silence, though the silence itself seemed heavier than any scream. The villagers watched, some with pity hidden in their eyes, others with fear that kept their mouths shut. They knew that to speak in her defense would be seen as rebellion against the king, and rebellion carried its own cruel punishments. Yet, within her, the cry she could not utter with her tongue tore through her soul like a storm that had been chained. It rose like smoke, invisible to the guards and courtiers, but thick enough that the spirits of the unseen world could sense it. Her agony was not only from the chains that dug into her skin but from the injustice that had been forced upon her. She had not defied the king, yet she was treated as though she carried the arrogance of a traitor. The humiliation of being paraded as a warning crushed her pride, but even then she refused to give her captors the satisfaction of seeing her broken voice. Instead, her silence became its own resistance, though the anguish it concealed boiled inside her like fire. The air around her seemed to grow tense, her unspoken suffering traveling farther than her oppressors could imagine. Children who watched from their mothers' sides felt chills run down their spines, though they did not understand why. Elders closed their eyes, silently whispering prayers under their breath, for they recognized that a soul in such agony does not cry unheard. The spirits of the land, the ancestors whose bones nourished the soil, had long been listening for cries like hers. Where human ears only heard silence, the unseen world heard a roar. Every pulse of pain from her chained wrists became like a drumbeat calling across the veil. Every silent tear that slid down her cheek became like a river connecting the living with the spirits who waited in the shadows. The guards smirked, believing her silence to be surrender, but they could not see the truth unfolding. With each moment that passed, her desperation deepened, and her soul's cry grew louder. She pleaded not only for freedom from her chains but for justice from the heavens themselves. Her body trembled, her breath sharp and uneven, but within her, the cry shaped itself into a plea that even the gods could not ignore. The world around her, though seemingly still, began to shift in small ways. The wind picked up ever so slightly, brushing against her face as though trying to comfort her. The ground beneath her bare feet felt alive, pulsing faintly with warmth. She kept her lips closed, for to speak would invite another strike from the guards, yet she was unaware that her silence carried far more power than any word she could utter. The unseen world listened, and her agony became a call for balance, a reminder that injustice cannot bury truth forever. What the king and his guards thought was the breaking of a girl was, in fact, the awakening of forces they could not control. Her silent cry had reached the threshold of the spirit realm, and though she could not know it yet, the ancestors were beginning to stir. The earth seemed to tremble softly beneath her chained body, as though something ancient and long forgotten stirred in its depths. Her silence, more powerful than 1,000 cries, drifted across the air like a plea not meant for mortal ears but for forces that had existed long before the king, long before his guards, long before the village itself. The villagers, though too afraid to speak, felt a strange shift in the air, a sudden heaviness that pressed upon their chests, leaving their breaths short and uneasy. The wind that had moments ago been still began to stir, circling her bowed figure in slow, deliberate swirls, almost like hands caressing her wounds. In the distance, the trees lining the village outskirts groaned as if sighing awake from centuries of slumber. Birds that had filled the air with their chatter fell into silence, retreating into the branches with unease. Those who listened closely would later whisper that they heard voices in the rustle of the leaves, low and mournful, rising with each breath the girl struggled to take. The chains clamped onto her wrists seemed to sing their own mournful song, echoing through the still air like a drumbeat summoning something unseen. The ground beneath her feet pulsed with energy, faint at first, like the heartbeat of the earth itself, but growing stronger with every tear she refused to shed, with every ounce of pain she bore in silence. The people shifted nervously, sensing something they could not name. A child clung to his mother's leg, whispering fearfully that the shadows were moving though the sun stood firm above. The elders among the villagers knew these signs. Long ago, their ancestors had told stories of spirits bound to the land, guardians who slumbered until injustice grew too sharp, until blood and purity mixed to form a cry powerful enough to pierce the veil between the living and the unseen. It was said that the spirits answered not the proud, not the kings or warriors, but the humble, the wronged, the pure-hearted who carried pain without malice. The girl's silence, her refusal to curse the guards, her quiet endurance as iron gnawed her flesh, became the call those ancient spirits had awaited. A cool wind brushed against her cheeks, lifting strands of her hair as though unseen fingers sought to comfort her. Her heart, though heavy, felt a strange warmth flicker within it, like an ember refusing to die. Around her, the villagers shivered as shadows lengthened unnaturally. Some swore the chains on her wrists glowed faintly, though the sun had not dimmed. The guards, hardened men who had faced war and blood, suddenly felt unease crawl down their spines. They shifted their spears nervously, looking at one another with unspoken fear. For though they could not name it, they felt the presence too, a weight pressing upon their souls, a whisper that they were no longer the strongest figures in this moment. The spirits were listening. They had heard the voiceless cry carried through the wind, felt the blood that trickled down her wrists into the dust of the earth, and recognized it as the offering of one unjustly wronged. The earth stirred again, stronger this time, and the villagers knew, though none dared to speak, that something was waking, something older and greater than the king who had ordered this cruel punishment. Her suffering had broken the silence between worlds. And now, the spirits, restless and rising, had turned their eyes upon her. Descriptive style? The guards had thought the iron links would break her spirit, but instead they began to tremble in a way that no hand had caused. The heat spread slowly at first, like the warmth of an ember hidden beneath ash, then suddenly flared with a brilliance that startled even the most hardened soldier. The villagers gasped, many clutching their mouths as the black iron glowed red, then white until strange markings, symbols no one could read yet everyone felt, etched themselves into the surface. The girl's tears dried upon her cheeks as the pain twisted into something else, not gone but transfigured. The agony did not vanish, but it was reshaped, as though her suffering had been melted in the fire and reforged into strength. Her arms shook, not from weakness but from the energy coursing through her veins. The chains that had bitten her flesh now pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat, alive, breathing, no longer cold metal but something that carried her spirit's cry within it. The guard stumbled backward, their spears rattling, for they had seen punishments before but never chains that writhed as though they were serpents of fire. One link snapped apart with a sound like thunder, and though it did not fall from her wrist, it wrapped around her hand in a spiral, glowing fiercely. The other links followed, curling upward, encasing her wrists and arms as if protecting her instead of wounding her. Sparks leapt into the air, but they were not ordinary sparks. They hung like tiny stars before dissolving into faint whispers that only she could hear. The villagers began to murmur prayers, unsure whether they were witnessing a blessing or a curse. Some fell to their knees, trembling, while others ran, fearing the king's wrath if they were seen rejoicing in her transformation. The king himself, watching from his raised seat, leaned forward with narrowed eyes. His punishment, meant to inspire fear, now turned into a spectacle beyond his command. He shouted for his guards to seize her, to tighten the bonds, but every attempt to touch the chains burned the men's hands as if they had grasped fire. The soldiers recoiled, cursing, and even the bravest dared not approach. The girl stood trembling, her body frail but her spirit expanding outward, filling the space. The chains glowed brighter, casting long shadows across the earth, and the ground beneath her feet quaked slightly as if in recognition of a power older than the throne itself. She did not understand fully what was happening, yet deep inside she felt a shift. The same chains that had crushed her now lifted her. The metal carried her pain but also amplified her will. She remembered her silent cry, the cry that had risen from her soul rather than her lips, and she realized that cry had been answered. Her suffering had called the spirits, and the spirits had chosen to dwell within the very instruments of her torment. Where once there had been nothing but helplessness, now there was a terrible, beautiful strength. The villagers who met her gaze no longer saw only a humble girl accused unjustly, but someone marked, someone set apart by forces greater than kings. The king's voice rang out again, ordering the spectacle to end, demanding fire to quench the glow. But no flame dared touch the chains, for they were flame themselves, alive with a mystical heat that burned yet did not consume. Instead, the torches brought closer by the guards dimmed, their light swallowed by the brilliance already wrapping the girl. The chains had become symbols. Symbols of resistance, symbols of transformation, symbols of a spirit that could not be silenced even when bound. And in that moment, though she stood still and bound before all, it was not the king who held power, but the girl whose chains had come alive. The air around her seemed to tremble as if the unseen world had leaned in to listen. For so long her lips had been sealed by fear, shame and pain, but now, as her body still bore the red marks of iron and her wrists carried the imprint of cruelty, her mouth opened. What came forth was not her own fragile voice, but something vast and ancient, layered with echoes that did not belong to her. It was the voice of the land, the voice of the winds that had swept through mountains for centuries, the rivers that had carried the blood and prayers of the people, the spirits who had slumbered beneath the soil waiting for the moment justice was demanded. The villagers gasped, clutching their chests as her words rolled through the square like thunder, shaking them to their very bones. "You have ruled with fear and fear has blinded you," the spirits spoke through her, their tone both wrathful and sorrowful. "You have shackled the innocent, silenced the weak and mocked the cries of the oppressed. But the land does not forget and the earth does not forgive. Today your cruelty is weighed against the truth." The king, seated high on his carved throne, shifted uneasily. His face, once firm and filled with the arrogance of authority, paled as the girl's eyes glowed with light not her own. Her body shook, as if unable to contain the power of those who now used her as their vessel. The guards who had once tightened her chains staggered backward, no longer brave, their spears trembling in their grip. They looked at her with terror, unable to reconcile the frail girl they had mocked with the divine force now pouring from her lips. The villagers who had once stayed silent, pressed closer, their fear mingled with awe. Mothers clutched their children tightly, whispering prayers, for they knew the voices that spoke were not of mortals but of their ancestors, the guardians of justice long thought gone. The girl's frailty was gone. She stood straight, her small frame radiating an aura of judgment, her voice carrying a weight that pierced the heart of every listener. "You built your throne upon suffering," the spirits thundered through her. "But know this, power born of cruelty cannot last. You tore her flesh with iron, but the chains you forged now bind your soul. The pain you ignored is written in the sky, and the earth rises to testify against you." The ground beneath the square seemed to rumble, faint at first but growing stronger, as dust shook from the wooden beams of the houses. The king gripped the arms of his throne, his breath shallow. Never before had he been confronted in such a way, not by a soldier, not by an enemy, but by the very people he ruled, their voices carried now in the chorus of spirits. The girl's eyes welled with tears, but they did not fall as her own sorrow. They were tears of the land itself, ancient grief for generations of pain. The words continued to pour from her mouth, unstoppable, unstoppable as a flood. The blood of the innocent cries from the ground. The silence of the oppressed has reached the heavens. You thought yourself untouchable, but even kings must stand before judgment. The crowd shivered at those words. Some fell to their knees, unable to withstand the pressure of that divine authority. The guards dropped their weapons altogether, spears clattering onto the dirt, unable to even look at the girl whose frailty had become the mouthpiece of eternal power. The king tried to speak, but his voice cracked, faltering under the weight of what surrounded him. He raised a hand as if to silence her, but the spirits spoke louder, their tones rising like a storm. You cannot silence truth. You cannot chain justice. You cannot bury the cries of the earth. Your time has ended. The air grew thick, heavy with unseen presence. The villagers swore they could feel countless unseen eyes upon them, ancestors and guardians alike bearing witness to this moment. The girl's body shook violently now, her small chest rising and falling as though it carried a storm too great for her mortal form. Yet still she stood, still she spoke, still she declared the judgment that was not hers but that of the spirits themselves. The king shrank in his seat, trembling as though stripped of all his grandeur, and for the first time, the villagers saw not a ruler but a frightened man. The people began to murmur, voices breaking through centuries of silence, their whispers rising into shouts of recognition, anger, and courage. For they realized that the girl's voice was not only the voice of the spirits but also their own voice, their grief, their hunger, their chains, their silence, all of it given power at last. Her voice rang out one final time, booming with finality. The cruelty of your reign is broken, and justice rises in its place. And with that, silence fell over the square, a silence so deep that even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The girl's chest heaved, her body trembling from the strain, yet her eyes remained lit with the glow of something greater than herself. The king sat frozen, his face pale and his crown heavy on his bowed head. The people stared, knowing the world they had lived in just moments before had shifted, forever changed, under the weight of her words. The palace walls, once thought to be unshakable, trembled beneath the weight of an unseen force. The king sat upon his gilded throne, but his crown felt heavier than ever before. The echo of the girl's spirit-filled voice lingered in the air, carried by the winds like a curse that no fire could burn away. He had silenced many voices before, rebels, prophets, even his own kin, but this one was different. This one carried the weight of the spirits. Outside, the skies darkened unnaturally, and the sun hid behind swollen clouds. It was as though the heavens themselves had turned against the king. His advisors whispered of omens. His priests offered desperate prayers. Yet nothing eased the growing unease that clung to every corner of the kingdom. Farmers looked to the skies in despair as their crops wilted overnight. Rivers that once flowed clear now churned with mud and decay. Cattle died without reason, their bodies stiff and lifeless in the fields. The people began to murmur. At first in hushed tones, afraid to be overheard, but soon their whispers turned into loud voices. The king has brought this upon us, they said. The chains that bound the innocent girl have bound us all to suffering. The villagers who once cowered in silence remembered the sight of the chains burning with fire and falling from her wrists. They recalled the tremor in the guard's hands and the power that filled her voice. It became a story retold in every household, passed from lips to ears until it became prophecy. Rebellion brewed quietly like embers beneath ash. Men sharpened their tools not only for farming but also for battle. Women hid messages in baskets of grain, spreading word across villages that the king's cruelty had brought the wrath of the spirits. Even the children, who once ran freely through the fields, now spoke of the girl as if she were a legend walking among them. The spirits chose her, they would say. She will be the one to end his reign. Within the palace the king grew restless. His sleep was broken by nightmares of chains coiling around his body, tightening until he could not breathe. He heard whispers in the halls, though no servant dared to speak in his presence. He saw shadows where none should be and smelled smoke when no fire burned. The guards, once loyal and fierce, began to falter. Some abandoned their posts in the dead of night. Others stayed, but their eyes betrayed fear. Then came the storms. Winds tore through villages, but instead of destroying, they seemed to rise against the king's armies. When his soldiers marched to crush a rebellion, lightning struck their path, scattering them before they could raise their swords. When the king demanded grain from the starving people, floods swept away the wagons before they reached his palace. The land itself had turned traitor, answering only to the spirit's call. famine struck next, and the palace no longer gleamed with abundance. The king's storerooms emptied faster than they could be refilled. Desperation seeped into the noble halls. Servants deserted, ministers argued, and the once unified court split into factions. Some urged the king to repent before the girl and the spirits. Others demanded harsher punishments for those who spoke against him. But the king, proud and unbending, chose cruelty over humility. Yet cruelty only hastened his fall. Rebellions flared across the kingdom, no longer hidden but open and defiant. The people fought not with fear but with purpose, believing the spirits themselves fought alongside them. Villagers armed with little more than stones and sickles defeated trained soldiers. The girl's name was shouted like a battle cry, echoing through valleys and across rivers. In his desperation, the king tried to summon his priests to silence the spirits. They chanted long into the night, sacrificing animals, burning incense and invoking ancient gods. But their voices cracked, their fires sputtered, and their rituals fell empty. For the spirits had chosen their vessel, and no prayer could unbind what was already set in motion. The king's paranoia consumed him. He trusted no one, not even his closest kin. His son fled the palace under fear of his father's wrath. His generals abandoned their banners. Alone and broken, he sat upon his throne, clutching the heavy crown as if it could still protect him. But the crown had become nothing more than a curse, pressing down on his brow until even his thoughts felt crushed. And then the final blow came, not from an army, not from a storm, but from within the walls of his own palace. The guards, trembling from weeks of unrest, turned against him. Some refused to carry out his orders. Others laid down their weapons before the rebels stormed the gates. The once mighty fortress that had guarded him for years fell not by sword, but by silence, the silence of men who no longer feared him. The king's throne room, once a place of glory, became his prison. The people dragged him from his seat of power, his robes torn, his crown cast into the dust. They looked upon him not as a ruler, but as the source of their suffering. The spirit's wrath had stripped him of everything: his armies, his wealth, his power. What remained was a man brought low by his own cruelty. And so the tyrant fell. His name, once spoken with trembling reverence, became a curse spat into the wind. His downfall was not merely the end of a reign, but the breaking of chains that had bound an entire kingdom in fear. The land, once poisoned by his hand, began to heal under the whispers of the spirits. The villagers who had once watched in silence now raised their voices together. The chains that had once burned into the girl's skin became the symbol of their freedom. The spirits had spoken, the tyrant had fallen, and the kingdom would never again forget the cost of silence in the face of cruelty. The village would never forget the day chains became wings. Long after the tyrant's downfall, long after the spirit's wrath had quieted and the skies had cleared, her story was carried in whispers, songs, and carvings etched into wood and stone. She had walked among them as a simple girl, silent and humble, mocked by many and ignored by most. Yet, when the cruelty of the king sought to break her, it was she who broke the very chains meant to bind her. From that day forward, she was no longer remembered as the girl with chained hands but as the spirit-touched one, the one whose suffering awakened a power greater than any throne. Mothers told her story to children as they tucked them into bed, their voices low but reverent, reminding them that strength often hides in silence, and power often grows in the places where no one dares to look. Farmers, as they bent over their fields, sang songs about her resilience, saying that the rains which now watered their crops were blessings left behind by her sacrifice. Even warriors carried her memory like a shield, engraving her name upon their weapons to remind themselves that no enemy, no matter how cruel, could stand against truth blessed by the spirits. The chains that once cut into her skin were no longer seen as tools of punishment but became sacred relics. The blacksmiths of the land reforged them, not into weapons but into symbols of freedom. Some pieces were melted into small charms worn around the necks of villagers, believed to bring courage in moments of fear. Others were set in the foundations of meeting halls and sacred shrines, so that every gathering of the people would be built upon her endurance. Whenever those iron links caught the sunlight, villagers said it was her spirit shining, reminding them that pain could transform into strength and strength into legacy. The king's palace, once a looming shadow of oppression, crumbled into ruin after his fall. But where his throne once stood, the people built a new gathering place, a circle of stones open to all, where decisions were made not by the will of one but by the voices of many. At the heart of that circle, they placed a stone carved with her image, a girl with uplifted arms, chains burning like fire in her hands, eyes closed yet shining with the power of the unseen. To kneel at that stone was not an act of worship but of remembrance. People did not call her goddess, for she had been human. They called her a bridge, the bridge between suffering and strength, between silence and power, between mortal flesh and eternal spirit. As years turned to decades, her story stretched beyond her village. Travelers carried her name across rivers and deserts, across mountains and coasts. Each land that heard it reshaped the tale, but the heart remained the same. A girl punished unjustly who turned her punishment into deliverance not just for herself but for all. In one place she was remembered as the chain breaker. In another she was called Daughter of the Spirits. In yet another she was known as the Silent Flame. Wherever her story went, it ignited something in the hearts of those who heard it. For the women who had been silenced by cruelty, her tale was a mirror reflecting their hidden strength. For the poor who bent under heavy burdens, her story reminded them that no weight lasted forever. For the children born in fear, her legacy became a lullaby of hope, teaching them that tomorrow could always be brighter than today. And for rulers, her memory stood as a warning, that tyranny may last for a season, but when the spirits rise, no throne can withstand their judgment. Generations passed, but her bloodline continued. The children of her village grew into leaders, storytellers, healers, and warriors who carried her courage in their veins. They claimed no crown, no throne, no empire, but wherever they walked, people felt a presence, soft but unshakable. It was said that when one of her descendants lifted their hands in prayer, the wind shifted and carried their words farther than ordinary voices could travel. Some even whispered that her spirit lingered in the roots of the great trees, in the flow of the rivers, in the fire that warmed their homes. She was not gone, not truly. She had become part of the land itself. But her truest legacy was not in chains, shrines, or stories, it was in the way people changed. They no longer watched in silence when injustice rose. They no longer bowed their heads when cruelty demanded their obedience. They remembered her agony, her silence, her endurance, and they knew that even the weakest voice, even the most fragile body, could carry the strength of spirits if the cause was just. And so, when children gathered around the fire and asked their elders, what became of the girl whose chains turned to fire? The answer was always the same. With solemn eyes, the elders would say, she walks with us still. In every tear that turns to courage. In every silence that becomes a roar. In every chain that is broken she lives. She was no victim. She was the beginning of freedom. And with that, the flames of the fire seemed to flicker brighter, as though the spirits themselves leaned closer to listen. Generations passed, yet her name never dimmed, carried from lips to lips like a sacred song. Children born long after the tyrant king's fall grew up hearing her tale whispered by mothers at dusk, told by fathers around fires, and sung by wandering storytellers who traveled from one village to the next. She was no longer just the girl bound by chains, she became the one who had transformed them into something greater, an eternal symbol of resistance, courage, and hope. Where once people had bowed their heads in silence, now they raised them with pride, invoking her memory in moments of fear and struggle. In the beginning, many feared to even speak of her, as though her memory still carried danger. Some whispered that the king's loyalists lingered, seeking to erase all traces of her story. Yet the people's hunger for truth was stronger than their fear. Quietly, in small gatherings, they spoke of her suffering and the miracle that followed. They described the moment the spirits answered her silent cry, the moment the chains burned with power and slipped from the grasp of men. Soon her story became more than history, it became a lifeline. Mothers would comfort their crying children by saying, "Endure, little one, for even the girl in chains endured and she rose." Farmers working the cracked earth in times of drought reminded each other, "Do not lose faith, the spirits still walk with us as they walked with her." And warriors marching into battle would strike their spears upon their shields and chant her name, as if summoning her courage into their blood. Over time, shrines were built where the chains had fallen. Not temples of stone or gold, but simple places where people laid offerings of flowers, beads, and carved wooden figures. Each offering was a prayer, not for wealth or power, but for strength in the face of suffering. The elders taught that her spirit lingered in those places, not trapped but watching, guiding, reminding people that freedom was never given. It was taken, fought for, and preserved through unity. Her story spread beyond her village, beyond her land. Traders carried the tale with them as they crossed deserts and rivers, carrying salt, cloth, and ivory. In distant lands, where kings ruled with iron hands, people heard her story and found courage to resist. Some claimed that her spirit appeared to them in dreams, whispering of resilience, showing them that chains, whether of iron, fear, or injustice, could be broken. Thus, she became more than a daughter of one village. She became a daughter of all oppressed people, a shared inheritance of strength. With time, the people no longer remembered her by her suffering alone. They remembered the fire in her silence, the way her spirit touched both earth and sky, the way her agony awakened forces greater than kings and kingdoms. Songs were sung not of her pain but of her triumph, and dances were performed where dancers bound themselves with ropes only to break free, symbolizing the spirit's victory over oppression. The tyrant king's palace fell into ruin, swallowed by weeds and silence. But in its shadow rose a gathering place where the people celebrated freedom. Every year at the season of harvest, they would gather in great numbers, lighting fires that burned all night long. Storytellers would stand before the crowd, their voices carrying across the fields, recounting the girl's story once more. But they did not tell it as tragedy, they told it as prophecy fulfilled, a promise that no chain could last forever. Children were taught that she was not merely one girl, but every girl, every boy, every soul who had ever been wronged. They were told, the spirits answered her because her heart was pure. If your heart too is pure, the spirits will walk with you. And so, her legacy was not carved in monuments of stone, but in the character of those who lived after her. Yet legends grow and her story grew with them. Some said that after her death, the chains themselves vanished, turning into rivers that gave life to the land. Others said they became roots of great trees that spread across the hills, sheltering generations under their shade. A few swore that they had seen her figure in storms, her voice echoing in the thunder, warning kings and chiefs never to walk the path of cruelty again. The elders never denied these tales, for they knew the power of belief. They allowed the legend to breathe, to grow, to weave itself into the lives of the people. For whether the details were true or not, the message remained, the girl was no victim. She was freedom itself, freedom clothed in flesh, bound and beaten yet never broken. Years turned to centuries, and though kingdoms rose and fell, her story endured. Some rulers tried to claim her legacy, declaring themselves chosen by the spirits as she had been. Others sought to erase her, burning shrines and forbidding her songs. But no fire could burn memory, no decree could silence the tongue of a mother teaching her child courage. Her spirit remained unshaken, woven into the rhythm of drums, the flicker of firelight, the whispered prayers at dawn. The chains that once tore her flesh became symbols worn with pride. Young men wore iron bracelets as reminders of strength. Women wore necklaces carved in the shape of broken links, symbols of resilience and honor. Warriors carved chain patterns into their shields, believing they carried her fire into battle. And so, what once was an instrument of suffering became a universal emblem of power. Even the spirits themselves, it was said, continued to walk with her. Some storytellers told of a night when lightning split the sky, and in the flash her silhouette appeared, chains burning like stars around her. Others swore that in times of great injustice, her cry could still be heard in the wind, a warning to oppressors, a comfort to the oppressed. Her legacy was not simply that she had survived, but that she had transformed suffering into a gift for generations to come. Where others saw weakness, she found strength. Where others saw chains, she saw fire. And where others saw silence, she found a voice that spoke through the ages. She became a queen not of crowns or thrones, but of memory and spirit. A queen whose reign stretched beyond her lifetime, beyond her land, beyond even the grasp of history. Her people no longer bowed before kings. They bowed before justice, before freedom, before the enduring reminder that one voice, even a silent one, could awaken the world. And so, the girl lived on, not in flesh but in story, not in chains but in freedom. She was remembered not as a victim, but as the spirit touched one who turned her pain into prophecy, her chains into power, her silence into a song that could never be silenced. Every fire lit in the night, every drumbeat echoing through the earth, every prayer whispered under the stars carried her memory forward. The girl who had once been bound became the one who bound her people together, reminding them that no chain, no matter how heavy, no matter how cruel, could last forever.